This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Hey there, it's Rose. Today's Best in Climate is entitled Climate Justice, for the first time ever, is on the G7 agenda. It's written by Mart Hertsgaard, who is the executive director of a wonderful new organization called Covering Climate Now. It's a global journalism initiative committed to more and better coverage of the climate story. So it's an organization I'm happy to be a part of, happy to have been invited to be a part of, where we share our stories in the hopes that our voices go out louder. Mark is also the environmental correspondent for The Nation, where this article first appeared, and the author of books including Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth. So again, climate justice for the first time ever is on the G7 agenda. If rich countries want a livable planet for themselves, they'll have to pay what they promised. This weekend's summit will show whether they will. Leaders of the 7 richest countries per capita are meeting at the Group of Seven's annual summit this weekend, and climate justice is explicitly on the agenda. That has never happened. How the G7 leaders respond to the climate justice challenge this weekend will shape the chances of success at November's Global Climate Summit that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls, quote, our last opportunity, end quote, to diffuse the climate emergencies. 2021 is a make it or break it year, Guterres said in an interview this week with the Global News Consortium Covering Climate Now. I think we are still on time, but when you are on the verge of an abyss, you need to make sure that the next step is in the right direction. At issue are the promises that rich countries made in the 2015 Paris Agreement, promises that they have flagrantly violated. Most media attention has focused on G7 countries' pledges to cut emissions enough to limit global temperatures rise to, quote, well below 2 degrees Celsius, and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Current policies and emissions trajectories instead put the Earth on track for a 2.9 degree Celsius increase by 2100, a de facto death sentence for millions of people and countless ecosystems, moving humanity further down the path toward extinction. That disquieting prospect continues to spur grassroots protests against oil, coal, and gas development, including the Keystone XL pipeline in Canada, whose owners finally canceled the project this week. Equally important, though much less discussed, is rich countries' Paris Agreement pledge to provide $100 billion a year to help developing countries quit fossil fuels and protect against climate impacts. This obligation, which was to take effect in 2020, was grounded in the truism that climate change is overwhelmingly caused by the rich, but disproportionately punishes the poor. Rich countries have not honored their $100 billion pledge either. Instead of $100 billion a year of climate aid, they've provided about $20 billion, according to an analysis that the global anti-poverty NGO Oxfam conducted of 2018 figures, the last year of authoritative data. Boris Johnson, Britain's Prime Minister and the host of this year's G7 summit, and Guterres have said they will press the other G7 leaders, U.S. President Joe Biden, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga to make good on their Paris Agreement obligations. Doing so is a matter not only of justice, Guterres told Covering Climate Now, but also of establishing the trust between rich and poor countries. Trust that Guterres believes is necessary in order for the COP26 climate summit this November to succeed. G7 leaders must guarantee that they will provide the climate aid they promise, Guterres said, and, quote, clarify how the $100 billion will be delivered, end quote. Supplying climate aid is not an act of charity, but rather of self-preservation, according to a landmark International Energy Agency report released last month. In order to hold the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the IEA said the world must halt all fossil fuel development, and both developing and developed countries alike must shift rapidly to non-carbon energy. That shift will be impossible for developing countries, Guterres said, without sizable financial and technological help. The climate crisis and the COVID pandemic share something big in common. Quote, you can't protect yourself unless you protect everyone else, end quote, said Rachel Kite, the World Bank's group's special representative to the Paris Climate Summit, and now the dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. To that end, G7 leaders need to make it clear at this weekend's summit that they will, quote, share their vaccine surplus and share it now. Otherwise, we're going to have variants coming back and we'll never escape, end quote. Likewise, rich countries must help, quote, get the entire world off coal, end quote, if they themselves want to survive climate change, Kite added. Quote, it's one boat. You don't survive in your end of the boat if the other end of the boat is going underwater, end quote. But rebuilding trust with developing nations is problematic, given G7's countries' poor record on climate aid, said Salim Moul Hook, director of International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh, who was instrumental in helping diplomats from the global south insert the 1.5 degrees Celsius target in the Paris Agreement. Quote, it's the same 7 countries that made that promise of climate aid in the Paris Agreement, which they reneged on. So if they're going to have any credibility or trust, they're going to have to deliver the money they were supposed to for 2020. And then there's another $100 billion due in 2021. The issue is the credibility of the G7 leaders and whether we can believe anything they say at all, end quote. To hear rich countries tell it, they actually have done a pretty good job of fulfilling their climate aid obligations. Citing 2018 data from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, a group of 38 of the world's highest income economies, rich countries gave roughly $79 billion in aid in 2018. But Oxfam's analysis of the OECD data reveals that this $79 billion figure is wildly inflated and based on dodgy definitions and accounting tricks. Some 75% of the $78 billion was given as loans that must be repaid rather than outright grants, said Tracy Carty, a senior policy advisor at Oxfam who co-authored the Oxfam analysis. And some aid was for projects that only a very forgiving mind would consider climate friendly. For example, Japan claimed that its investment in a new coal plant in Bangladesh, a country with some of the world's most vulnerable ecosystems, qualified as climate aid because the new plant was more efficient than older models. What's more, only 20 to 25% of rich countries' aid helps poor countries protect themselves from the heat waves, droughts, storms, rising seas, and other impacts of rising temperatures. Instead, most aid has been aimed at reducing emissions in the biggest developing economies, such as China, India, South Africa, and Brazil, Hook said. while only 20% has gone to the most vulnerable countries, like my country, Bangladesh, to adapt to the impacts of climate change. One reason is that investments, quote, in renewable energy projects generate revenue that allows loans to be repaid, end quote. Giving poor people money to survive storms and floods does not. Highly vulnerable developing countries demand, Hook added, that half of all climate aid should be for adaptation in the most vulnerable countries, and that such aid must come as grants and not loans. If G7 leaders do not issue a credible guarantee this weekend that they will honor their climate aid and other Paris Agreement obligations, then the world is headed for failure at the Make or Break Climate Summit in November, Hook and Kite said. The nearest thing we have to global government are these 7 big economies. And if they decide to do something, then that something gets done, Hook said. So far, both with climate aid and COVID vaccinations, the G7 leaders see themselves as the leaders of their own countries and don't care about the rest of the world. And they think they're going to be safe, but they're not going to be safe. Again, Mark Hertsgaard is the executive director of Covering Climate Now. Seems like we're really up against the wall, and this weekend we'll know more. Are we going to continue on the trajectory that we're on, which really does feel like annihilation for humanity? Or will leaders actually lead? Guess we're going to find out. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.